Hi, I'm Joe, and welcome to the Shadows of Truth. This is the first episode of Shadows of Truth, so I wanted to start with something that requires us to slow down. A quick heads up before we start. If you're here for fast timelines, clean answers, or someone confidently pretending that this case isn't obvious, you're probably in the wrong place. I do long form true crime and mystery commentary, which basically means I talk through cases the way my brain actually works. Out loud, a little messy, occasionally irritated, and very suspicious of anything that's supposed to make perfect sense. We're going to talk psychology, belief systems, bad decisions, and system failures. I'm going to have opinions on them, and some of those opinions are probably going to be a little out of pocket, but I promise they're at least honest. If you like your true crime, thoughtful, opinionated, and slightly unhinged, you're in the right place. Alright, let's get into it. This story isn't about people who wanted to die. It's about people who thought they were going somewhere else. When people hear the word cult, they think they know what that means. There's yelling, control, an obvious bad guy, just one very obvious bad guy. From the outside, it's very clear that something is wrong, and that's not really what's happening here. That's the thing that throws me and most people about Heaven's Gate. They weren't violent or aggressive or living behind gates with weapons. They were quiet and structured and honestly normal on the surface. And that's the part that I don't love about it. You might not love about it. Because we like to think danger is obvious. We like to think we'd spot it immediately. But stories like this one mess with that idea. Belief doesn't always look extreme when it starts. Sometimes it looks organized, calm. Sometimes it looks like answers. This isn't a story about people snapping or losing their grip on reality overnight. It's people slowly changing how they explain the world to themselves, one idea at a time. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, and I want to be very clear about this because it's important. These were not unintelligent people. They weren't reckless. They weren't blindly following someone. They were searching for meaning. And that's not weird. It's human, and we all do it. What makes Heaven's Gate hard to talk about is that there isn't a clean starting line where you can look and say, okay, here's the mistake. There's no single moment where everything goes off the rails. It's just small ideas that don't sound that dangerous by themselves until there are enough of them. That's why I don't want to rush this, because if we rush it, it turns into shock content. If we oversimplify it, it turns into judgment. But if we actually slow it down and look at how the belief system formed, it starts to make sense. That's an uncomfortable fact, but it does matter. So this isn't about the ending yet. It's about how people get there. So now that we've talked about why Heaven's Gate doesn't look like what we expect a cult to look like, we have to kind of zoom out for a second, because stories like this don't happen in isolation. Belief systems don't just appear fully formed out of nowhere. They have to land somewhere. And they land differently depending on what's already going on in the world when they show up. And this is the part that people like to skip because it's not dramatic. There's no shocking moment here. But if you ignore it, the rest of the story doesn't make sense. So before we talk about specific people, before we chat about leaders or followers, we need to talk about the environment that this idea dropped into. The question isn't really how could anyone believe this? The better question is why did this belief feel reasonable at the time? This idea didn't show up in a vacuum. It showed up in the 1970s, and the 1970s were chaotic, honestly. This was a time when a lot of people were realizing that the systems they were told to trust didn't actually have their backs. The governments lied, wars dragged on without clear reasons. Authority stopped feeling moral and started feeling performative. People were disillusioned, and more importantly, they were tired. Traditional religion wasn't working for a lot of people anymore, but nothing solid had replaced it. So there was this weird gap where people still wanted meaning, wanted answers, and something bigger than themselves, but didn't know where to put that need. When that happens, people don't stop believing, they start experimenting. This is where New Age spirituality really takes off. Eastern philosophy, meditation, astrology, reincarnation, higher consciousness. All of this was becoming mainstream enough that you didn't have to be a total outsider to be curious about it. At the same time, you've got UFO culture exploding. NASA is landing people on the moon. Space suddenly feels real and accessible. The idea that we might not be alone stops being sci-fi and starts being a genuine question. So now you've got a world where authority is questioned, religion feels outdated, and science feels exciting but incomplete. And people are open to the idea that reality might be bigger than what they were taught. That's the environment Heaven's Gate drops into. When you put it like that, the question isn't how could anyone believe this? It's more like, why wouldn't someone listen? Because Heaven's Gate wasn't saying everything you know is wrong. They were saying, what if there's more? For people already feeling disconnected or uncertain, that's not a hard sell. It's an invitation. Before there was Heaven's Gate, before there was belief system or rules or doctrine, there was just a person. That person was Marshall Applewhite. Applewhite didn't start as a cult leader. He started as someone who felt deeply out of place. He grew up in a very religious environment where Christianity was central and rigid. For a while, that structure worked. He studied music, he taught, he cared a lot about meaning and purpose, but there was always tension. Applewhite struggled with his identity, especially around sexuality in a world where deviation wasn't just discouraged, it was framed as moral failure. That kind of internal conflict doesn't disappear, it sits there. When someone can't reconcile who they are with the framework that they've been given, they either reject belief entirely or they start looking for a version of belief that explains why they feel the way they do. Applewhite didn't reject belief, he reframed it. Over time, his life began unraveling. Jobs didn't last, authority figures didn't trust him, his sense of direction kept slipping. Just to ground this down a little more, this was not a stable period in his life. When someone already feels they don't belong, that kind of instability doesn't just feel stressful, it starts to feel meaningful. Like proof that the problem isn't you, it's the world. At this point, there was no cult, no doctrine, no followers. Just a person using belief to make sense of himself. This is important because belief was still personal, but belief doesn't stay personal forever. Everything changes when Applewhite meets Bonnie Nettles, because this is where belief stops being internal and starts being shared. Nettles believed deeply in spirituality, astrology, and destiny. The idea that people were meant for specific paths. So when she and Applewhite connected, their ideas didn't clash, they reinforced each other. Applewhite was searching for meaning, Nettles already believed meaning was written into the universe. That's not manipulation, it's validation. And validation is powerful. Doubt starts fading and belief starts echoing discomfort, becomes confirmation. And once belief is shared instead of questioned, it stopped being flexible and starts hardening. This wasn't a takeover, there was no dramatic shift, just two people slowly building a worldview together and protecting it from doubt without realizing that that's what they were doing. Belief became shared, and shared belief becomes defended. Eventually, belief stops being something you talk about and starts being something you organize your life around. That's when it becomes doctrine. Rules appear, language tightens, and structure forms. The belief system begins separating people from their physical bodies. The body becomes the container, the self becomes something higher, and the earthly identity starts to matter less. And here's the thing, this doesn't feel extreme inside the system. It feels clarifying. Doctrine removes ambiguity. It replaces doubt with certainty. And once certainty takes over, questioning feels like failure. Not because anyone forbids it, because it no longer feels necessary. Belief stops being a lens and becomes a boundary. And by the end of part 1, that belief system feels complete, finished. Which is why what comes next isn't a sudden collapse, it's an escalation that feels to the people inside it completely consistent. And that's where we stop. This is usually the point where people want answers. They want the moment where everything clicks into place, where you can point at a decision or a person or a belief and say that's where it all went wrong, and that moment doesn't really exist here. What we have instead is something quieter, slower, and much harder to sit with. By the end of this part, the story, nobody thinks they're doing anything extreme. The belief system feels complete. It feels settled. It feels like it explains everything that used to feel confusing, like a red flag when it answers your questions. Nothing feels dangerous when it gives you certainty. Nothing feels alarming when it finally makes the world make sense. There's no panic here, no dramatic break from reality, just people living inside a framework that feels right to them. I think that's why this story sticks with people the way it does. Not because of how it ends. We all know how it ends. Because of how reasonable it feels right up until it doesn't. It forces you to ask uncomfortable questions, like how much certainty is too much, or when belief stops being a comfort and starts being a cage, or whether we'd recognize the difference if it happens slowly enough. None of this starts with bad intent. It starts with people trying to belong, trying to understand themselves, trying to find meaning in a world that feels unstable and indifferent. When belief finally gives them that meaning, when it feels complete, there's very little incentive to look outside of it. That's where we're leaving this. Not at the ending, not on the belief system that feels finished, closed to doubt, closed to the outside world, and ready to carry people somewhere they genuinely believe they're meant to go. In part 2, we'll talk about what happens when certainty meets the real world, what changes after loss, and how the doctrine escalates, how belief systems that once felt comforting becomes something people are willing to give everything for. But for now, this is where we stop. There was an ending. There was belief. Belief, when it stops allowing questions, is powerful enough to carry people farther than anyone on the outside thinks possible. This has been the very first episode of Shadows of Truth. Thanks for hanging out with me while I think through this case. If you stuck around until the end, feel free to subscribe to my channel. Lots more true crime and mysteries in the future. Until next time.